So I have a few closing remarks on Aristotle's doctrine of the mean before moving on to a couple other important aspects of that reading. You may have noticed in the text language around the mean and then other language around the median. So for the most part, the virtue or the virtuous state is the mean, and the virtuous action is the median. So what I mean is that on the one hand, the analogy to health shows the universal applicability of the virtuous mean. So everyone needs a moderate amount of food and exercise. Too much or too little will negatively impact our health. And to be clear, what I mean by moderate amount, I don't mean that everybody needs the same amount, but everybody needs an intermediate amount, right? For everybody, there will be a too much food and there will be a too little food. And so in this sense, I don't mean moderate in terms of moderation or in terms of restriction, but I mean moderate in terms of in between. So when it comes to our health, everyone needs a moderate or middle amount of food and exercise because too much or too little will negatively impact our health. And in the same way, the generous act will always be between giving too much and giving too little. Right? Giving too much and you will go broke, giving too little and you won't actually be that helpful. Right? So in the same way that for health, everyone needs an amount of food that is somewhere between too little and too much. In the same way as that, generosity will act also. That the generosity will always be between giving too much and giving too little. But on the other hand, the example of Milo, the famous wrestler from the text, demonstrates that the moderate amount is not the same for everyone, right? And the golden mean is not a mathematical mean, but a practical one, meaning it is set by an individual's context and ability. So the doctrine of the mean is trying to name what is universal about ethics, which is that the virtuous state will always, in all cases, be a median state between an excessive state and a deficient state. For all virtue, generosity will always be between the virtues of stinginess and wastefulness. But what your generous thing to do is that will always be determined or will always be sort of completed from context. How much, right? How much the generous amount is. That is specific and so requires context. And this is why ethics is imprecise, because we can't get the specificity of the generous act without the rest of the contextual features. All we can get at the universal level is a general claim about generosity as a mean state between these excessive, the state of excess and a state of deficiency. The median is going to be this specific action you take, and you will find it based on your context. So how do we find that median? How do we find that context-dependent, morally virtuous action? Well, at the end of Book 2 in the Nicomachean Ethics, Aristotle gives us some practical advice. So there we see that the difficulty of acquiring moral habits lies in the difficulty of determining the specific action called for. The virtuous mean may be simple enough to determine, but the median is difficult because of the variation and particularity of actual situations. In other words, the specific action to be done is difficult to determine because of the imprecise nature of moral matters. When determining the specific virtuous action, we need to account for the persons involved, the timing, the resources available, things like this. Being able to apply principles to concrete contexts requires training and practice. There is no way to know what to do ahead of time, out of context. The only way to secure knowing how to handle the variation of moral situations is practice. So the example of the surgeon again, who must know textbook anatomy and be able to adapt to the unique features of the particular persons she operates on, right? Knowing only anatomy in the academic sense would not help, would in fact make them a terrible surgeon. We need our surgeons to understand how to apply these universal rules to the particular context, to the particular bodies of their patients. When it comes to moral virtue, right? It's the same application process is sort of being described here by Aristotle. To be a moral expert is going to require understanding certain universal features of ethics, of moral philosophy, of moral virtue, or I should say the nature of moral virtue. But it also will require you to know how to handle a situation based on those rules, but not limited by them. So to facilitate the necessary practice so that we can actually hit the mean and develop the virtuous characteristic, Aristotle gives us two pieces of advice. They can be simplified into choosing the lesser evil and knowing yourself, more or less. And so this advice comes from an observation that Aristotle makes in chapter 8 of book 2 about our tendency to only identify one opposite for each virtue. But then he goes on to expound on these ideas in chapter 9, and that is sort of where I'll be focusing here. But so for the advice of choosing the lesser evil tells us that the virtuous mean is not exactly in the middle of its two opposing vices, but it actually tends to be a little more like one vice over the other. So when you don't know what the virtuous action is to do within a situation, then Aristotle advises, act according to that vice which the mean is more like. For example, the virtue courage, Aristotle thinks, will be closer to rashness or recklessness than to cowardice. And so if you are in a situation that calls for courage and you don't know exactly what the courageous thing to do is, Aristotle's advice is, well, shoot for the rash thing or the reckless thing, because we know that, or he argues, he holds that the rash or reckless thing to do will be closer to the courageous thing to do than whatever the cowardly thing to do is. And the advice of knowing yourself, right? Aristotle advises us that each of us have our own natural and learned tendencies. We might be quick to anger, we might fear speaking up, we might not call our family enough, right? All kinds of stuff. Aristotle uses pleasure as an example that of a state that has a strong hold on a lot of people, because he observes that it is pretty common, right? A lot of people are tempted by pleasure and then act to pursue it. But it's also pretty basic, right? So it is it's likely very common because a lot of us, it likely is, the fact that a lot of us are susceptible to be tempted by pleasure is probably the case because it's such a sort of basic function of our being that it can be very powerful, much like being hungry, right? It can really affect our ability to think critically about the situations we're in, much like being hungry can or being tired can. So most of us, when we experience a weakness of will kind of moment, it's because something else feels good. And then there are other explanations for why we might not do the thing we intended to do or the thing we tried to do, why we might be tempted away from doing what we were initially doing, whatever. Some other explanations might just be anxiety or exhaustion. But I still think that Aristotle's observation about the power of pleasure over us is still pretty accurate. But his advice from this example, his advice is to recognize these tendencies that we have and then overcorrect. So when faced with a situation where someone makes you angry and you know that you're quick to anger, aim at patience by overshooting to extreme patience, which in the table of virtues is called lack of spirit, which is kind of a whatever, kind of a bummer word, but the idea is sort of like a state of a state of uh, yeah, a state of extreme patience is sort of what I like too, right? It's a lot of like holding your tongue and holding your emotions in check, and letting something unfold and something happen before you that you are not okay with, right? So if you're in a situation that makes you very, very angry, and you know that you are very quick to anger, meaning from your experience, you have realized that you get angry very fast. The important piece here that is understated in Aristotle's philosophy is that you think of times where you were disappointed at how fast you got angry and then what you did when you were angry, right? Where you don't want to get this angry this fast, or you don't want to be this angry this often, right? That's kind of what we're talking about. Not talking about situations where you are angry and you should be angry because a great injustice has unfolded in front of you, or somebody has violated you in a meaningful way, or somebody has abused somebody you love, right? Aristotle's not saying that there aren't times to be pissed off. There are. But his point is that by and large, we don't have to be pissed off all the time. That if you are angry all the time, or if you get angry over things that are not worth being angry over, here's a strategy for trying to habituate a different way of being. So you overcorrect to this. You sort of shoot for extreme patience, with the idea that you could actually hit patience, right? So the idea here is that given your tendency to be that you are the idea here that you are a person who tends to be very angry, if you shoot for extreme patience, you likely won't hit extreme patience, but you will fall close to the mean. That's what Aristotle's idea here is.